And joining us now on the debate in Denver, Colorado, Suisheng Zhao, Professor and Executive Director of the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation at the University of Denver. In Boston, Massachusetts, Daniel Drezner, Professor of International Politics at Tufts University. And here in studio, Peter Harder, Senior Policy Advisor at Fraser Milner Casgrain and the President of the Canada-China Business Council, and Gregory Chin, Professor at York University and a Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo. Good to have everybody along for tonight's discussion here in studio and in Points Beyond in the U.S. I want to start by reading something that Neil Ferguson and a colleague wrote in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago, and then we'll come back and talk. A few years ago, we came up with the term Chimerica to describe the combination of the Chinese and American economies, which together had become the key driver of the global economy. For a time, Chimerica seemed not a monster, but a marriage made in heaven. Global trade boomed, and nearly all asset prices surged. Yet, like many another marriage between a saver and a spender, Chimerica was not destined to last. The financial crisis since 2007 has put the marriage on the rocks. Correcting the economic imbalance between the United States and China, the dissolution of Chimerica, is now indispensable if equilibrium is to be restored to the world economy. Let's go around the horn on this. Daniel Drezner, to you first. Do you believe, as the authors do, that the economic marriage between China and the United States is ending?
No, which is actually one of the problems. You can argue that the underlying macroeconomic imbalances that Neil Ferguson and others are concerned about are continuing unabated. The thing is, the Great Recession hasn't really affected it. So there's definitely tension in the marriage, let's put it that way. And the question is whether or not they have to go to couples counseling, which I would strongly recommend.
You would recommend. And where would you like them to start?
The IMF would be a pretty good place. The G20 will also be good. They fortunately got a lot of meeting places where they can go out and get together and talk a lot.
Okay. Suisheng Zhao at Denver, let me get your view on that. What's your view on this marriage counseling that Daniel Drezner has suggested?
Indeed, I think they need to learn from each other and also adapt to each other. They have been rediscovering each other's problems and advantages, just like any marriage. You have to know each other at first before you get married. Even after you get married, you have to rediscover each other and also reappreciate each other. Then you find problems to adapt or readapt to each other. In fact, in my view, this marriage has been doing really well since Obama came to office. These two countries have come to a term of a cooperative, or Obama said cooperative, positive, and a comprehensive relationship. This relationship has never been better in the last 20 years.
Gregory Chin, at the risk of torturing this metaphor a little further, how do you see the marriage?
Well, I think both sides, Washington and Beijing, both realize that they need some fundamental changes in the relationship, in their growth models, but to actually bring about the changes that are needed. In other words, for the United States not to be so reliant on China providing it with, buying up U.S. treasuries is not so simple. The United States has become quite reliant on China to help its own growth. And also for China to diversify domestically more, as well as South-South trade. In other words, diversify beyond the U.S. and the EU, or at least reduce its trade reliance. That's also not a simple matter for China to do.
Peter Harder.
Well, if you take the marriage analogy, I guess I would say that there was a period of infatuation with the shopping experience. But what they need to do is have a more sustainable, durable relationship. And that means thinking of the longer term and the codependency both economies have one with the other and the broader world. And I think that's a maturation process that the economic crisis, the global crisis, has accelerated, and I believe it is being reasonably well managed, frankly.
Daniel Drezner, this is a pretty odd couple. What makes you think that couples counseling would actually work?
As some of the other commentators have said, I mean, these are both countries with tremendous strengths and also tremendous weaknesses. I think one of the big problems is that from the perspective of Washington, Beijing looks like it's amassing ever-increasing amounts of power in sort of an uninterrupted increase in growth. And of course, from Beijing's perspective, Washington is the only superpower out there and tremendously powerful and dwarfs China right now in terms of any kind of power measures. So there's a tendency to ignore the other side's weaknesses that I think has to be put on the table. It's one thing to say, for the United States to tell China, for example, you need to expand your domestic consumption, but it is ridiculously hard for the Chinese government to actually find a way to do this. Similarly, it's very easy for China to tell the United States, you have to get your fiscal house in order, but of course that ignores many of the political realities in terms of trying to sustain a recovery in the midst of the Great Recession in Washington.
Gregory Chin, how much is it in China's advantage to keep things just the way they are right now?
I think Beijing would love to see things continue on the way they've been going, in some ways in the sense of continuing to be able to access the U.S. market, and even in some ways to continue to be able to fund American debt, right? But I think at the same time, Beijing realizes there are some inherent vulnerabilities. For example, on sitting on a $2 trillion reserve, in which a large part of the reserve is held in American assets, and where the Chinese themselves don't control the money supply, and therefore the value of the reserve itself. So I think that this is where, in China, from China's standpoint, it would be in its interest to, continue on, being able to access the U.S. as it's been able to.
Professor Zhao in Denver, how about you on that situation? China's advantage to keep things as is?
I think China would like to see the relationship as the trend it has been going toward now more cooperation, and China would like to U.S. to continue to buy more Chinese goods, and in the meantime, China could invest in the U.S. But China has a lot of suspicions about U.S. In fact, that came back a week before. They cannot believe that the relationship has been going so well. They are very suspicious if the relationship could continue like this. So there are a lot of questions on Chinese leaders' mind at this point. And they want to be treated equally by the United States, but they are also don't know how to behave like a normal big power in relationship with the United States.
Let me read something Mark McKinnon wrote in the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago. Here's the quote, and then we'll show a couple of charts as well after that. Once upon a time, the visit of a U.S. president would bring concessions from a Beijing leadership grateful for the attention and affirmation. Not anymore. This time, Beijing is ready to trade Washington's list of demands for an equally long list of things it wants to see the American administration do. 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, an American president is heading into what could be described as the first post-Cold War superpower summit. The U.S.-China relationship is important enough that many now refer to Washington and Beijing as the G2. Having said that, look at these numbers here. Here's the GDP figures 2008 estimated for both China and the United States. And we hear about how China is catching up so rapidly to the U.S. and may soon overtake the U.S. But look at the American economy is still 3.5 times the size of China's, and military spending as well. In 2008, the United States is, off the charts compared to what the Chinese are spending right now. So, Peter, is the rhetoric that we are hearing about the new, powerful China and the very humbled United States, does that actually match reality?
I think both descriptions are a bit overdone. What they are talking about, though, is the trajectory of history. There is no doubt that China will grow and overtake the size of the U.S. economy.
If things continue
perhaps
the way they are.
Exactly. Having said that, that is not, I don't think, a threat. This is a relationship that requires each other for their own success. China needs a stable political environment in which they can grow the domestic economy, have an expansion of their urbanization and the challenge of their environment, as well as rely on an export market like the United States for currency and for global status. So there's a bit of realism that is coming to bear on both relationships as they look at where are we going to manage this in the long term. And I do think that the financial crisis has accelerated the inevitable trajectory they were both headed on, and it has perhaps crunched the time frame for our having to recalibrate our mindset as to what's the relationship going to be, what should it look like, how are they going to have to adapt one to the other.
Daniel Drezner, let me get you on this rhetoric versus reality issue.
I tend to agree that the rhetoric, the McKinnon quote you read is vastly overblown. It's worth pointing out that actually Obama on his trip actually did get some significant policy shifts from China, both on global warming and on Iran in the IAEA. It was just that he didn't trumpet it, and that China didn't do it prior to his arrival. So, I think he did pretty well on the China trip. In terms of the actual power versus reality, I'm not sure the graph you showed is terribly fair in terms of GDP. I actually think that understates China's economic power. If you go by market exchange rates, you're correct, but if you go by purchasing power parity, which is another way of measuring it, China's economy is actually much larger. But you're right. I mean, the public perception is that China's economy is either going to overtake the United States, in the next year, or has already overtaken it. Some U.S. polls suggest that Americans already think China is more economically powerful, and of course, that's not the case.
Professor Zhao, how do you see this rhetoric versus reality issue?
I think reality is important only in the context of the perceptions and also trajectory someone mentioned earlier. The gap between China and the US used to be so big. So at that point, people's perception was China cannot compete or China cannot do anything that makes US upset. But now China has been narrowed the gap between these two countries. So the image has been gone far ahead of the reality. And that we have created the image that these two powers are more or less in parity. In fact, that's not the case, but the image is there. And that image has met some demands or expectations for the politicians and for people to expect the behaviors of the leaders in China and in the US. And that's why you read that you read earlier about China is no longer to making concessions to the U.S. presidential visit, and even some kind of perceptions that the Obama's visit was a failure. In fact, that's not the case. The case is that the reality from that perspective is that these two countries has been more or less in an equal game, although the GDP or those numbers are not matching that. But in a diplomatic game, these two countries are more or less equal. They have to treat each other that way, and neither side has learned well to treat each other as equals. For the U.S. for so many years as a superpower in the world, people has so many expectations. On the China side, China has not been learned how to behave as a responsible big power in the world. So their activities, in fact, sometimes on the one hand, you said they will not make concessions. On the other hand, they are not competent on many issues. And in fact, they're talking about they are still developing countries do not take responsibilities on those climate change issues.
Okay, let me follow up if I can for a second with Gregory Chin.
Confusion there.
Gregory Chin, let me follow up with you on this. You watched some of the coverage of President Obama's trip to China, and there were numerous commentators who said that he was kowtowing to the Chinese while he was there. Did you get that sense?
No, I don't think it's a situation of kowtow whatsoever. I think whether it's Obama, whether it's President Bush beforehand, I think there's a recognition now of both the structural interdependencies between China and the US. And this is, I think, some realpolitik that's actually coming through. And I think this is smart diplomacy on the part of, the President Obama. And I think that,
but the president, he didn't raise the Dalai Lama issue. He didn't raise human rights publicly. He had a town hall meeting in which he didn't take any questions from, the questions he did take from students were all very planted and very gentle. This is, I think if President Bush had tried to do that, he would have got raked over the coals. This guy did it, and I guess in some circles got away with it, but others said he was kowtowing to the Chinese by doing so. You're not buying?
No, I think largely we have to look at what were the priorities that President Obama was focusing on for that trip, and I think one of them is ensuring that China helps with funding the stimulus package, that the United States is, has built up. And so I think this is where that's part of it, and I think they're looking at overall the broader strategic relationship at this point in time. And that includes Moscow and those hotspot issues, North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan. These are issues, big issues that the United States is having to focus on. And I think that this is largely a matter of priorities. Yes, I agree there have been some shifts as far as how high the human rights issues on the agenda, but I think, this is a matter of prioritizing.
Daniel, what do you say on that?
I tend to agree. I don't think, it's not like when George W. Bush was talking about human rights or Bill Clinton before him in China, they really got all that much out of it. I mean, yes, they got to make the statement, and in some ways you could argue that pleased, the domestic American audience much more than it pleased the Chinese. So I agree. I think the atmospherics have changed. I don't think the actual structure of the relationship has changed. You're seeing a case where both countries are trying to feel each other out. I do think that the argument that there's a G2 out there is actually dangerously overstated, and it actually overestimates the power of both the United States and China at the expense of countries like India or the European Union or even Canada.
This G2 talk, Peter Harder, what do you think about it?
Well, I think it is overstated. It's an important acknowledgement of the symbiotic relationship and the emergence of China as a larger player. But a G2, we're a long way from that. G2 isn't going to deal alone with the big strategic and political issues globally. It's important, but let's not go overboard. G20, I think that's the phenomenon of the last year that has truly emerged and changed power relationships. And China is a full player in the G20, and that's got to be acknowledged. The reality is that we are all adjusting to the need for China to exercise greater economic, political, and security power and role in this changing world. And that means we're going to have to adjust our expectations and how we engage China as we think about these issues.
When you think about the great programs on television that deal with matters of international relations, Saturday Night Live doesn't automatically come to mind. However, let me set this piece of tape up, and Daniel Drezner knows where I'm going here. The U.S. federal government owes China $800 billion, and when you include the debts that are held at state, municipal, and corporate levels, the number is around $2 trillion. And Daniel Drezner recently wrote that the following clip explains why this situation gives China remarkably little leverage over American affairs. SNL, here we go, roll tape.
You know, as I listen to you, I am noticing that each of your plans to save money involves spending even more money. This does not inspire confidence.
I assure you, you're going to get your money.
Will you kiss me?
I'm sorry?
Will you kiss me?
I don't understand.
I like to be kissed when someone is doing sex to me.
Okay, Daniel, you're on. Why do you think this clip represents U.S.-China relations and the debt situation in particular so well?
I'm glad to know that I can export American culture in this way.
Remember, it's a Canadian that's been running that show for 35 years.
That, touche.
Okay.
I would, in some ways, the clip shows two things. It shows the Chinese, acting in a somewhat more haughty manner, berating the Americans, asking questions about America's fiscal responsibility, which gives the appearance that China actually has considerable amounts of power because the United States owes China so much money. But the point of the clip, actually, is that China is incredibly frustrated, that they actually can't get the Americans to make the policy adjustments that they want them to make. And in part, this is because China has no other place where it can put its money. The reason it's buying up so much U.S. debt is because, among other things, it wants to keep the yuan relatively cheap compared to the dollar. The only way it can do this, the only way it can keep the yuan pegged to the dollar and to stop it from appreciating, is to continue to buy more and more dollar assets. So it's actually China that needs the relationship, as was talked about earlier, to be in the status quo. The United States can continue to run a fair amount of debt, and China doesn't have anywhere else to, to put its wealth. So in that sense, it shows that even though it looks like the United States owes China a lot of money, which is true, to paraphrase Keynes, if the United States owes China about $1 billion, that's the United States' problem. If it owes China $2 trillion, that's China's problem.
Indeed. Professor Zhao, can you come in on that?
I agree with that. In fact, that show distorted the reality. And the reality is that, as the previous speaker talked about, China and the U.S. now, they are dependent on each other. On those debt issues, as he said earlier, China have no other places to put their money except the U.S. government bond treasury, which is the safest. And also, China can make most of that. In that case, the point, I think, is that these two countries really have to work with each other to resolve financial, economic, and many strategic issues. Come back to the G2 point. Although I don't agree that G2 from policy perspective is something we can pursue, but they also reflect the reality that many problems economically, politically, diplomatically, you cannot resolve them without cooperation of these two big powers.
Gregory, let me go, I guess, do the Watergate thing and follow the money here again. If, on the one hand, you know, picking up on what Daniel said, yes, when you owe $2 trillion, there is some good question about who's actually in the driver's seat. But is this not also evidence of the fact that the Chinese are extremely dependent on the U.S. consumer at the moment?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. China is dependent on the U.S. consumer, also the EU consumers. But I think that this is where, if you do some research into what's most interesting thing is how China is now trying to diversify, right? Increased trade and investment linkages in the so-called third world, the developing world, with the emerging market economies, Brazil, Russia, India. Not only short-term kind of deals, but long-term deals, where they actually start trading in each other's currencies, right? Where they lock in natural gas supply from Russia for 30 years, for example, or they work out long-term deals with Brazil for natural resources. And it's beyond Argentina, Mexico, you know, there's all kinds of, and so I think the most interesting thing is now also beginning to examine how China is gradually trying to diversify, because they realize there are inherent risks.
Peter, you want a word on that?
Well, yeah, I think that both sides have an interest in stability and deliberate change, a pace of change which gets off of just the binary relationship. But they cannot risk a disruption that would cause a lack of confidence in the American consumer, or too much domestic pressure on within China, because that is a high priority for their own stability. So what we're working through is the world that we will see in 15 or 20 years, which will have perhaps more than one reserve currency, that will have multiple players in the Chinese economy and global economy. But we need to ensure that this is done in as least disruptive a fashion as possible for both of these countries to succeed.
Understood. We want to prove to you tonight that we are not a one-trick pony when it comes to showing comedy shows from the United States. We don't only show the programs that are run by Canadians, we also will show some comedy shows run by Americans. For example, South Park. This clip talks about stereotypes and making people afraid. It's a comedy show, but there's a deeper, darker meaning underneath it. Roll tape, please, Michael.
No. Eric, sweetie, are you having nightmares about the Chinese again?
They're gonna take over the world. Too many of them. No, leave us alone. No.
Sweetiekins, are you all right?
Man, the Chinese are gonna get me.
No, sweetie, the Chinese aren't going to get you.
They are so. There's 2 billion of them, and their economy is getting better, and with their advances in technology, they're going to bring down America.
Daniel Drezner, again, a comedy show, but does that tap into something that is just below the surface in your country?
I don't doubt that it does tap into some fears, which is, you know, you look at China's historical growth rates over the last 30 years, and it seems like they, you know, if you extrapolate from current trends, it does seem like they're going to rapidly overtake the United States. You know, on the other hand, if we were talking about 10 years ago, we'd be talking about the miles and miles of U.S. surpluses in terms of its budget. It's really dangerous to extrapolate just from past trends. China has a lot of issues it's going to have to cope with over the next 15 to 20 years in order to maintain its growth. I suspect that it will probably be able to maintain that. But that said, the notion that somehow China is going to, you know, inexorably overtake the United States, it does echo, as you said in the opening, you know, the hysteria that surrounded debates about Japan 20 years ago, and that obviously didn't happen as well.
Suisheng Zhao, how much of the West's talk about China, in your view, is based on rational analysis rather than fear or emotion?
I think they have both. China is indeed growing very rapidly. Chinese economic miracle and so-called China models of success, which has been followed. by many third world countries. So there is a reality of that China is rising rapidly. On the other hand, China has so many problems domestically and also internationally. In fact, if you go back talk to Chinese leaders, you'll always find there is an identity problem there. On the one hand, they are very happy to see China is rising as a rising power. People are cherishing China's rise. But on the other hand, they are also emphasizing that China is a developing country. China cannot take responsibilities that many big powers have been taken, and China still have to focus on its domestic issues. A lot of unrest in China, a lot of disparities in China, and a lot of corruption, not a problem which could become a problem that will stop China's growth in the next 10 or 20 years.
Gregory,
so there is a reality that
yeah, forgive me. I'm just going to go to
China
Gregory
is
here.
rising, but
how much of this, Gregory,
Okay.
do you see is based on rational analysis versus the fear and emotion angle?
Well, I think there's real concern both in Canada and the U.S. about potential job loss, right? How China's growing might and China's growing economy, and China's growing trading power may cause adjustment problems for everyone else. And I think that there are real issues here, and there are real adjustments that North America has to go through, Canada and the U.S. And so I think part of this is rooted in something real, and I think and there's also questions, about China when China goes abroad and wants to invest and buy up companies around the world. What does that mean for the workforce or for standards, labor standards or work standards or whatever, and I think that this is where probably China can step it up another level as far as explaining itself, transparency. Right. And so I think this is where, there are some concerns out there, but, I think at the same time, there is adjustment issues. And this is where I think psychologically, whether people in Canada and the U.S. coming around to the idea of China's rise, I think there is some psychological adjustment.
Peter, I'm going to use a very politically incorrect phrase here, but people used this phrase many generations ago when they talked about, quote unquote, a yellow peril. Are we seeing a return to that kind of thinking?
I'm sure that amongst some of the backlash to the consequences of the rise of China, there is some of that. The good news is that by and large, the policy players are rationalists. That's not to say they're looking at this through rose-colored lenses and right. don't see the challenges on both sides, but they're looking at this as a rational policy challenge and are working through it in appropriate ways. And that skit was quite disturbing when you think of it, from its racism, from its jingoism and nativism. There is that streak in American culture that we would want to guard against, even as Canadians.
Well, let me follow. Okay, good caveat at the end there. Let me follow up. Here's David Brooks in the New York Times from a couple of weeks ago. Asians place emphasis on context, while Westerners place more emphasis on individuals. The mode of thought, more common in Asia, is better suited to the complex networks that make up the modern world. The contextual associational style is simply more valid. The linear style we've inherited from the Greeks is less adaptive toward the modern age. I think, David Brooks says, I think the West may be doomed. Professor Zhao, I want to start with you because as someone from Asia, I wonder whether you are more flattered or insulted by that analysis.
I don't know, because I don't think China's rise has been that linear, and the Western has been in declining. In fact, the issue is not a relative decline or relative decline of the West or the U.S. It's the rise of the West. As someone mentioned earlier, the West has to adapt to the new reality. In fact, for the last decade, the U.S. has tried to maintain a unipolar world. U.S. remains at the top. The other countries hierarchically ranked below the U.S. That has not been successful. And the world, globalization, interdependence, everything has created a multipolar world. China's rise, just one of the many other non-Western powers emerging in the post-Cold War world. That creates a totally different world. The Western countries, particularly in the U.S., has to adapt to that. That's a reality. You cannot stop it. But
Okay,
it's
but
not doomed for the U.S.
Daniel, I'm going to go to you with this. I want to follow up on this ethnic stereotyping that we're seeing here. How much of the admiration in the West for the so-called Asian work ethic and the collective purpose is couched in old negative stereotypes of the kind of relentless, robotic Asian?
Well, you know, it's both old negative and old positive stereotypes. I mean, the flip side of this is the notion that Asians are somehow more industrious. But I got to say, that quote from Brooks might be the biggest crock I've heard this year. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. The notion that somehow either the United States or Europe is not capable of sort of complexity or embracing the idea of networks, whereas East Asia is, just doesn't jibe with reality. I mean, the reason why China has such dramatic economic growth has nothing to do with their embracing of complexity. It has to do with the fact that their wages are relatively cheaper, and they've been able to dramatically improve manufacturing productivity through brute force rather than anything else. So I think, and the other danger, I think the real true danger in that kind of stereotyping is the notion that Asians, period, are a single kind of ethnicity that you can lump all these stereotypes into, which, trust me, if you go over there, I think you will find that the Japanese, the Chinese, the Koreans, the Malaysians, the Indonesians all have very different opinions, very different cultures, and very different heritages.
No, fair enough. But Gregory, the one thing that, and I'll ask you about this, whether it was Japan in the 80s or China today, it's the notion that somehow non-white people are moving up the ladder that makes a number of people in the developed West who are white very concerned. And I wonder if that's affecting the way that Westerners talk about China today.
Well, I think there is some filtering. You know, I don't think we can say that none of this exists, right? And I think this is where there is some filtering. I mean, for example, to get a bit technical for a second, if the recommendation or proposal to set up special drawing rights or to strengthen special drawing rights in the reform of the international monetary system, perhaps it come from the Europeans and not Zhou Xiaochuan, China's central banker. Maybe the proposal may have been received differently. But I think this is where, you know, because SDRs have been around, like this idea has been around since the 1970s, right? So I think that this is where sometimes I think there is some kind of filtering that has to do with, you know, where the messaging is coming from.
Daniel, you're shaking your head on that. How come?
Well, I do think that you're onto something in the sense of, I mean, you might argue that the United States in particular has become comfortable with its hegemony in such a way that we're used to the fact, for the past 20 years, particularly since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has been used to the idea of being the only superpower. So it is somewhat jarring, I think, to Americans that you see other countries coming up with policy initiatives or things not necessarily always going through Washington before they happen. So I do think that this sort of sparks one of the fears that you're talking about, which is the U.S. is just not accustomed to the fact that there might be other centers of power, because for 20 years there weren't any other centers of power, or at least any other ones that could seriously challenge the United States. So I do think that has changed. I'm not sure that the fact that you know, it's an ethnic difference really matters all that much. I mean, Japan, you know, has been part and parcel of the OECD and every other major fora for the last 20 years. I don't think that there's really a problem with that. It might have something more to do with China's regime type. I mean, that is a genuine source of concern. The fact and the question of whether or not the Chinese value things in the same way that other governments do, not because their ethnicity is any different, but rather because the Chinese government looks very different from the U.S. government, the Canadian government, or European governments.
In which case, in our last couple of minutes here, let's consider this. Peter, how can Westerners approach the rise of Asia in general and China in particular more constructively than perhaps those clips from those comedy shows indicates?
Well, I think one is to acknowledge it and welcome the fact that we are on a trajectory which will see a recalibration of global political, economic, and security power.
You keep saying welcome it, but there are a lot of people who got a stake in kind of the way things are.
Well, but stability and well-being have a certain advantage to us as well. And the ability of the developing and emerging markets to achieve a level of economic performance that takes people out of poverty, that introduces them to a world of experience that we have become used to, is actually a good thing. And that we need to do this in a fashion where it's not an adversarial zero-sum game, but rather acknowledging the fact that we have a stake in the emerging markets succeeding in developing their economies and their societies. They've got huge problems. I mean, we shouldn't diminish the problems that China has from a demographic point of view, from a social cohesion point of view, from an urbanization point of view, let alone the environment.
Well, except that more people nowadays seem to be saying if you had to make a bet on the future, you might want to bet on the authoritarian versus the democratic way.
Well, I do think there's a bit of an issue as between authoritarian capitalism and democratic capitalism.
Right.
And that may be the paradigm that we want to spend some greater time researching and looking at.
We're going to do a future program on that. Professor Zhao, I've literally got 1 minute to go here. Can you come in on that, on the issue of democratic versus authoritarian capitalism?
China authoritarian capitalism has been successful so far, but in the long run, I don't think they can compete with the liberal democratic capitalism, because that system will eventually prevent people from participation and voice their complaints, then eventually will become a barrier for economic growth.
Daniel, you want the last 30 seconds on that one?
Sure. I mean, I think it's safe to say that, the model has worked to date. But, China was just polled, actually, a Lowry Institute from Australia just polled the Chinese in terms of what their concerns are. And the biggest concerns by far are environmental. And that's got to scare the Chinese leadership, because it was environmental activism that led to the downfall of communist countries across the Warsaw Pact. And so China's going to have to at least accommodate its domestic demands in order to continue any kind of sustainable growth going forward.
Gotcha. Thanks, everybody, for this discussion tonight. Suisheng Zhao at the University of Denver, Daniel Drezner, Tufts University in Boston, Massachusetts, Gregory Chin from CIGI in Waterloo, Peter Harder from the Canada-China Business Council. Good of all of you to join us tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, for more information about tonight's guests and for details of Prime Minister Harper's visit to China, please visit us online at tvo.org/theagenda. Tonight's debate was produced by Mark Brosens and Daniel Kitts, and you could read Daniel's post entitled Canada's China Policy Shift. You'll find that on our Inside Agenda Producers blog, also at our homepage, tvo.org/theagenda.